But a few more seconds, and let's hope we're live. Okay, so getting a bit of a late start here. Apologize in advance if we also go 2 or 3 minutes over the limit at the end. So Rosh Hashanah came and went. Yom Kippur and Sukkot are coming up. Now, last year I had the opportunity to talk about something relating to Rosh Hashanah. You can look it up if you don't remember it or you haven't heard it. I discussed the question of whether Yemenite shofars are kosher. Some people think, big, nice, twisty shofar, taken on Mitzrayim, it's an attraction, but Grade, there's actually some serious halachic concerns there, so that's a Rosh Hashanah related thing. Yom Kippur was also covered last year. The Yom Kippur topic discussed trusting doctors and medical opinions and how that relates, in fact, to vaccines, etc. So this year I thought to talk about something relating to Sukkot. Right? Many people are already hurrying and rushing to pick up their Daled Minim. And it seems appropriate to talk about the topic already at this point. Now, specifically, the topic I want to discuss is, do esrogim really exist or not? That's the question. Now, of course, if you're a Heisa Chassid, you don't begin to understand what the question is. The Rabbi used an esrog, and Zicher, the esrog exists, and we use the same esrogim. So, verstehe nicht the Shaila in Ganzen, what are we talking about? But if we zoom out a bit, and we take a look at the question and the topic of esrogim, and the kashrus of esrogim from the beginning of time until today, and we also take a wider look at the different varieties and types of esrogim, including how people, outsiders, not within our community, what their perspective is on the different types of esrogim that we have today. So there's plenty to talk about. And in fact, there's probably no way I'm ever going to be able to cover the topic anywhere near its entirety. And this includes history and a lot of halachic shaklavataria and the history of halacha specifically, and a lot of even technical, botanical knowledge. But in this, and this is probably just going to end up being more of a hakdama, and we'll have to, bli neder, Miz Hashem, have a hemshech in the short term we have next week. I'd like to cover a bit of where the discussion about various types of esrogim is holding nowadays. But first, let's get back to the question and define and explain the question a bit. I'm asking whether esrogim exist. What does that question mean? I mean, seemingly we see that they exist. No one's challenging that, unless we're getting philosophical about the nature of existence. But that's not what we're doing, right? So, but really, if you think about it, even outside the context of esrogim, halacha, this is actually a fairly widespread question you might hear in different variations today about fruits in general. Certainly in the last century, last bunch of decades, with scientific advances, but even before that, hundreds, thousands of years, farmers, those who grow things, have always attempted, whatever tricks they knew, whatever techniques they knew, to use methods and means to improve the crop that they were growing. In whichever, like I said, whichever means or methods or techniques that they were familiar with. At a very basic level, you have something called selective breeding, which is that you look for a particular tree, a particular fruit that has a certain trait that you want, and then you try to replant that and try to grow the rest of your crop from that, and then within those you look for the next level, the next fruit that has an additional trait that you like. There are ways to slowly but surely breed for certain traits and fruits that you prefer. Beyond that, you have kilayim, you have hybrids. There are means by which you can hybridize fruits with each other. And then you reach, nowadays we have genetic modification, GMOs, as you might have heard. So all of this is to say that the fruits that you see in the supermarket today may in fact be quite different than their ancestors, that our ancestors ate, whether it was 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or more. This is a very common, popular topic. You can pull up the first article that comes up, and you can see lists. So, for example, came across an article with a bunch of lists. Watermelons. We have paintings of watermelons from hundreds of years ago. They look very different. It's very clear that the watermelon that's just large, red, inside, that's a chiddush. Watermelons weren't like that a few hundred years ago. Bananas is a very classic example. That bananas 200 years ago were full of huge pits. Was not a very appetizing meichel. Also, there are actually dozens of variants of bananas, and the banana that we have today is based on a particular type of banana that was bred in whichever way to get to the result that we have today, which is of course very popular. Eggplants is another example. Carrots, in fact, you have a large red carrot. It's not necessarily what it looked like a few hundred years ago. Corn is a big example. When the Europeans reached America, the corn that grew here looked nothing like the corn we have today. A lot of work went into turning it into what we are familiar with today. Peaches are much different than they used to be. And there are many other examples of this. And that's all before GMO. Once you have the concept of genetic modification, and if you look into it, and you find someone who's a rabid opponent of genetic modification, you'll hear them use terms like fake food. Oh, it's modified, it's fake, it's not, you're not eating real fruits, these aren't the fruits that nature, etc. produce, this is fake. So, it's actually a pretty legitimate question to ask about any fruit that you're eating, like to what extent is this real, or to what extent is this the fruit that someone 500 years ago would have called this fruit? Is this apple the same apple, etc.? So the same logically would apply to the esrog. And for the sake of this discussion, we're going to assume, like the Ben Chomish Lemikra, that Pri Etz Hadar, esrog, citron are all the same thing. We're not going to challenge that. But here, the question is not just a stama question, it's also a halachic question. Meaning, if the Torah told us to take an esrog on the Yom Tov of Sukkot, so surely the Torah was referring to a specific fruit that has specific characteristics described in Chazal. And right now, within the frum, what we call the frum world today, everyone seems to be agreeable that we're talking about the same fruit. No one takes a different fruit on Sukkot. So we're all pretty much on board that the Torah means this fruit that we seem to think we're talking about. The question then would be, were there changes? Did changes occur over time? And if there are changes, should we say that at some point the changes are significant enough that perhaps it isn't any longer that fruit that the Torah was talking about? Maybe it's a different fruit. Or maybe it's only half the fruit the Torah was talking about. It's that and something else. Now, first I just want to define in slightly technical terms what an esrog is, because in case that's useful information, because I'm sure for a lot of us we don't really think of esrog as a fruit the way we think of other fruits. We sort of think of it as a chefsa shel mitzvah, but of course an esrog is a fruit. It could be classified within the world of fruits. So as we know, an esrog is a citrus. Let's just try to quickly define citrus. Obviously, when we say citrus, that could include the tree and the leaves, but we're talking about the citrus fruit. And those, of course, include, the famous ones are oranges, lemons, grapefruits, pomelos, limes. Those are the classic examples you think of when you think of a citrus. The way it's understood today is that all citrus originated in parts of Asia, and then at some point a few thousand years ago slowly made its way across the world, reached the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the part of the world that we're more familiar with, and then in the last 1,000 years or so made its way to Europe, and then ultimately to America, etc. But that there's a path all the citrus fruits took to get to where they are today. Then, of course, you can define and describe what a citrus fruit is like, what they all have in common, right? So they all have that leathery rind. Then there's the outermost layer, the part that you see that you can scrape and it's called zest. Then you have orange or other fruits, it's much thinner, but you have the white part right beneath. That's called the middle of the peel. That's called the pith. And then you have the actual fruit, what we call the fruit inside, and those are the juice kernels, whatever you want to call them. Pulp. And of course, another thing, so that's the description of the fruits. What they all have in common is that they have a certain smell, a nice smell, due to whatever scientific reason. And of course, there's the juice. You could squeeze the kernels inside and get juice. The juice tends to, or the fruit tends to have a sharp, relatively sharp flavor, etc., etc. That's citrus in general. So within that category, you have the esrog, which in English is called the citron. So it's a large citrus, clearly has a thicker rind than the other fruits we're familiar with. The one it's most similar to, of course, most would say is the lemon, at least in general appearance. Has a lot more, unlike the orange or the others, the white part under the rind is not very thin. Instead, it's quite large. In fact, most of the esrog is probably the white pith, and the juice and the stuff in the middle is much smaller portion of the esrog. So that's unique to the esrog compared to all the other popular ones. Of course, the rind is also a bit different, a bit thicker, harder, bumpier. There's a unique smell to the esrog as well. The inside, if you do try to eat the fruit, and the esrog is produced separately, besides the fact that Jews pay hundreds of dollars for the esrog that looks a certain way, citrons are commercially produced. You can buy them in certain markets. It is a fruit that people do eat as a fruit.
How do they eat it?
You cut it open. You can cut out the inside and eat it, or you can candy it. You can do different things with an esrog. But you look it up, you'll see people are familiar with it. People do eat it. I'm not even going to talk about China, where the fruits are said to come from. But China has its own variants of the esrog. It's definitely something that's grown. It was clearly grown for thousands of years, not just for people that wanted to have esrogim on Sukkot. Right, so it's on if you do eat the fruit, it's on the sharper side, although it could be somewhat sweet. There's the seeds, of course, that are, of course, part of that you see in every citrus fruit, including the esrog. What's unique about the esrog is the pitim. At least some esrogim keep the pitim, but you don't usually see a pitim on other fruits. But that is interesting that the esrog does have that. And of course, we're makbid that if it stays on, that it shouldn't break off. Then you have the range of color from green to yellow. If it gets too ripe, it can start turning orange. Right, so that's the description of the esrog as a fruit, thinking of it as a fruit. Interestingly, when we discuss citrus fruits, according to science, there are only 3 original citrus fruits, and the rest are all kilayim zemizeh. The original 3 are the mandarin orange, the pomelo, and the citron, and the esrog. So the esrog is one of the original 3. And everything that came afterwards, so we're talking about orange, lemon, grapefruit, etc., lime, they're all kilayim with each other. You take 2 and you combine them, however you might do that, and so on and so forth, and you can combine the toldas, toldasayim, zemzeh, you can keep on getting, infinite variations in theory. So after all, with all that in mind, so again, the question is, with the esrog, is there room for concern that there have been changes that have gradually or abruptly turned it into a different fruit, essentially, that the Torah wasn't talking about anymore? Right, so like I said, there could be the small changes over time. Lamaisa we see, right, of all the esrogim that people do use, an Italian esrog and an Eretz Yisrael esrog, they don't look exactly the same. There's a bit of a difference. That seems to be more of the natural changes you'd expect and differences you'd expect over time or due to different locations. But they're still pretty similar generally. You wouldn't say that they're like different minim compared to each other necessarily. So that's less of the problem. The bigger concern is in the last few hundred years about kilayim or murkav, the idea that there might be an esrog that was mamish directly murkav somehow with another fruit. Obviously, when we're talking scientifically, it can only be with other citrus fruits. They can be hybridized with each other. And be'ikr, the concern would be the lemon. And the question would be, is it possible that we have esrogim that acquired lemon characteristics, which the most obvious lemon characteristic would be that there's more pulp, more juice inside, maybe the rind is thinner. That's what you would imagine a lemony esrog. And really in a shiur last year, we're talking about tailaim and the shita of the Tzemach Tzedek regarding tailaim. So in the midst of all that, I mentioned that this Yesod, the Tzemach Tzedek had a discussion about how nicker the Teiloim have to be, and whether Tzemach Tzedek had a more lenient opinion as to how nicker, like meaning, right now you can't see them. Is there something you could do to find them? Maybe, but if you can't see them right now, it could be they're still bottle. So I mentioned that there's an interesting sefer from over 100 years ago, sefer Mishnas Reb Elazar, Elazar Bar Kahan of Polotsk. He was connected to Chabad. And at that time, there was the peak of the controversy over the various types of esrogim, the Korfu esrogim, and this and that. So he has this huge tshuva where he's going on and on into this type of logic. Lamer Zagin, the esrog, is murkav with a lemon. And it has all the samanim of the esrog on the outside. But we have reason to assume that there's a larger amount of pulp and juice on the inside. So can we say that the lemon sheba esrog is bottled to the esrog, Zormela is nochatz an esrog? That was the type of discussion he was having. And his part of his logic was that it doesn't even say the word esrog, it says priyetz hadar. And even if it did say esrog, maybe it's bottled to the esrog, so it's not mamayit this esrog that has some lemon inside. Then it says, what do you mean? How could you say bittul? It's not nikr mi b'chutz, but you can cut it open and then it will be nikr mi b'fnim. Here's where the Tzemach Tzedek comes in. The Tzemach Tzedek has this idea that if it's not nikr immediately, then maybe it is bottle, even if there's something you can do to make it nikr later. That's the type of discussion that you might find in these svarim, and there's a tremendous halachic in this vein, and the same goes for many achreinim. Now, really, we should differentiate between the categories of esrogim. We're talking about esrogim that you didn't use. So there's one general category, you can call them the Mediterranean esrogim, right? Of course, esrogim can only grow in certain areas. They're very sensitive trees. They don't do well in cold areas. Most of Europe, except Italy and Spain, is pretty north and pretty cold and pretty dark, and esrogim just doesn't work there, just like it wouldn't work in New York. But the lower down you go, tropical areas are more conducive to esrogim. So of course, Europe always had to import it from the Mediterranean. So when we say the Mediterranean, so what are we referring to? Referring to that includes Eretz Yisrael, which of course if you ask a Balabatish, not a Lubavitcher, when the Torah said Priyetz Hadar, what did the Torah mean? Where did the Torah think you should get a esrogim from? Pashtus, you assume the Torah meant you should take the esrogim that grow in Eretz Yisrael, and one assumes that the esrogim that still grow in Eretz Yisrael are probably Hamshech, either directly or indirectly from those original esrogim that have been growing there since whenever. So that's Eretz Yisrael. Mediterranean includes Eretz Yisrael. It includes Italy, specifically in Italy, the region of Calabria, which is all the way in the south, which is also nicknamed Yanover, which is somewhere else, but that's Kayadua. The Yanover is Genoa, where they shipped the esrogim from to Europe, which is in the north, but the esrogim themselves grow in Calabria till today. You can look it up. And to us, Chassidim, we say that no, the Torah, when the Torah said Priyetz Hadar, what did the Torah mean? The Torah meant Calabria in Italy, and Moshe Rabbeinu sent a shliach to get the esrog that the Torah meant from Calabria in Italy, Kayadua. And the third major area in the Mediterranean category would be Greece. It's a Vart Miyuchas that Alter Rebbe, yeah. No one else heard of that, no. So you have Eretz Yisrael, Italy, and Greece, and the surrounding islands. Now, like I said, you can find slight differences between them. You can say, oh, this is the Italian esrog, this is the Greek esrog. And it always was that way. You see, for as long as there have been discussions about esrogim, they differentiate between the different types. And even today, if you want to, write the name scientifically, botanically, you want to write sub categories of esrogim, you can say this is the Italian one, etc. But all of these esrogim, which were the ones that we, speaking from an Ashkenazi-centric perspective, are the ones we were always familiar with. So they're all pretty much the same. They're all like what we described earlier, with the peel and the fruit and the pits and all of that. So they're all pretty much the same. And that's where the whole Shiur of Murkov originated, regarding these three places, Eretz Yisrael, Italy, and Greece. And everyone accused everyone else's esrogim of being Murkov, and that's where we're up to today. Let's just take a look at the Alter Rebbe to see how the Alter Rebbe presents this concern. So if you look in Siman Tavresh Memches, Dvarim Apsulim Ba'esrig, you go all the way to the end, Sif Lam and Aleph. So Zok the Alter Rebbe, Esrig Hamurkov. So what's a hybridized esrog? So what does that mean? So the Alter Rebbe says we're talking about grafting. Grafting means there are two ways to plant an esrog. You can either take the seeds of an esrog and plant it and wait for a new plant to grow, or the quicker way, and this goes for many plants, you could just cut off a branch and stick it into the root of another tree and allow it to keep growing in that way. It seems like it was more common to graft esrogim than to plant them. The question is, what are you grafting it with? Are you grafting directly on another esrog root, or are you grafting it onto a different citrus tree? So the Alter Rebbe says, esrog hamurkav. You took a branch from one tree, and but the way the Alter Rebbe defines it is you took a branch from another tree and you put it in the Elon ha'esrog. For some reason, interestingly, that's the only tzad the Alter Rebbe mentions. So you took a lemon branch and you put it in a lemon tree, and whatever grew looks like an esrog. Pasuk shezeh ini esrog klal elahu bria b'fnei atzma. And the Alter Rebbe lists the simanim that had been discussed in Achreinim that describe an esrog that looks more like a lemon. And they look in the Marmakaimis there, Mitzayin to the Chuvas, Maripadva, Shutarama. This is where the discussion begins. Magen Avram, Taz. There's a Tzemach Tzedek about it. Maybe we'll get to it in the next part, maybe not. Leo Matasov, who's Dafka Mashkiach in the field of esrogim. Dafka wrote a shtickle a few years ago where he points out that the Alter Rebbe only mentions putting an esrog branch in, putting a lemon branch in an esrog tree, and not vice versa. Even though be'ikr, when you talk about a hybridized esrog, pashtus, it's the other way around. You take the branch of the esrog. The branch is the ikr when you do this. You would take the branch of the esrog and put it in a lemon. He wants to, if I remember correctly, I didn't look it up again. He wants to be medayek. Then maybe like the Alter Rebbe, the problem is not such a big problem if you if the ikr branch is the esrog. If he's a lot of the concerns following it up. A bit concerning that the mashkiach of the esrogim is writing this, but maybe he knows something that we don't know. So maybe, hopefully, we can get back to the question of Murkov, the history, and then some of the reality today. I want to go off now for the rest of this discussion and talk about the other categories of esrog. So there are two other categories of esrog from within the countries that Yidden lived in. Again, like I said, China has its own story. We're not talking about that. So the two other major categories are Moroccan esrogim and Taiman esrogim from Yemen. Speaking from a European Ashkenazic perspective, we did not know of these esrogim until the last 150 years or so, because there was no commercial contact apparently with countries as far away as those. They're both not considered Mediterranean. Yemen is in Arabia and Morocco is in North Africa. And there's seemingly less of a concern of Murkov. The whole Murkov controversy wasn't really chal on these countries. You can always accuse them and suspect them of whatever, but they didn't have the same kind of commercial growing and tzachrim and all of that culture around it the way Eretz Yisrael and Greece and Italy did. The thing about them is that they are somewhat significantly different than our esrogim. The Moroccan esrog, Stam Moroccan esrog, does not have pits inside. Very strange. Maybe we'll get to the technicalities as to how that's possible, what that means. But Stam Moroccan esrog, if you cut it open, you can look it up. I think in English, if you go to Google Images, put in Moroccan esrog, you'll see a picture of one cut open. It's just pulp, no pits. On the other hand, the Taiman esrog is all pits and no juice. You cut it open, you can find that also. You'll see just pits, essentially no juice. It's just the white, thick pith under the rind and pits, and then that's basically it. It happens to be that the pith itself is a lot more edible, and that was the paydi. That's apparently why they were growing it. That part was considered edible. But so for that reason, so on the one hand, you had European Rabbanim, etc., that were getting so nervous from the whole Murkov controversy that here's a whole different, these are untouched by controversy, by machlekes, let's just switch to Morocco, Lamar. Then you have, and some would say there's always, because of the business, and because of the sachrim and schayra involved, so there's always a motivation to find problems with the other guys' esrogim. So that's possibly part of the issue. So you have those that came along and said, Moroccan esrogim don't have pits. Are you sure they're the same min? Is you sure the Torah is even talking about this? Maybe this is something else, either scientifically or at least al pi Torah. And the same could be said for the Yemenite esrogim. It's supposed to be a pri, it's supposed to be a fruit. Where's the fruit? Is it the same thing? So, to get a bit into the actual discussion, so I'm going to go through some material. This is not my material. This is something that someone wrote a year ago on the topic of esrogim Morocco. So obviously you have different people that have their pet esrogim, the esrogim that they're a fan of, that they promote. So this is someone who's very pro-Moroccan esrogim. Right? Different people get hung up. Some people are very pro-Yanava, some people are very anti-Yanava, pro-Israel, anti-Israel, etc. Right? So I mean, just to summarize commercially, when we talk about esrogim today, you essentially have Yanava for Chabad or for other Chassidish kreisen, hold the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer a few hundred years ago also wrote very stark that the tradition in Ashkenaz was to get from Yanava. So that's why you see other types of people making their way into Crown Heights, looking for a good deal on a Yanava esrog. Greece is basically completely out of business. Eretz Yisrael, so you have some old types, and then you have the Chazanish type, which is maybe something we'll get to. The Chazanish essentially moved to Eretz Yisrael, picked a certain esrog that he decided had no chashash murka for whatever reason, for unclear reasons. But all his Talmidim and Chassidim, V'todas Taldisayim, decided that as long as we're shaking an esrog that grew from the esrog that he used, then we're safe, we're good, we're relying on the Chazanish, we don't have to worry about it. So that's a huge portion of the market today. Then you have the Moroccan and the Taimaneh. Those are basically the categories you have if you're shopping for an esrog beyond just your store in Crown Heights. So this is an article that was printed in Eitz Chaim, Kovetz Eitz Chaim, Bobav 45, came out last year, Sukkos. There's actually a part 2 to this year, but we're going to focus on what he wrote last year. So, starts off by mentioning, of course, as the esrog HaMurk of concern since Moshe Alshich and Eretz Yisrael and the Ramah regarding Italy. There's been this whole discussion. Plus, there was some kind of virus or fungus, I didn't look it up, that started spreading among citrus trees in the 1800s, and that caused a lot more grafting, and that's when farming and raising fruits got modernized, so there was a whole new wave of concern of grafting at the time to try to protect the trees and plants from these problems. So essentially every esrog has someone who is its naysayer. So the question is, what about Morocco? He says Morocco, they weren't brought to Europe until quite recently. The first Jews in Europe to start using Moroccan esrogim, dafka, were the Sephardim. So you have the Sephardim were expelled from Spain. A large portion of them ended up in Morocco and strongly influenced Yiddishkeit in Morocco. But then, as time went on, you had various Spanish Jews that ended up in a number of new European cities. So you have Hamburg in Germany, you have Amsterdam in Holland, you have London in England. Those are all sort of new communities that started popping up in the 1600s with the Sephardim. The Sephardim, many of them were ex-Anusim, involved in international business, very wealthy communities, but they had more of a connection with Morocco due to the Spanish connection. So, Lamashal, the first time you see Ashkenazi Rabbanim talking about Moroccan esrogim, as we will hopefully see, was when they came in contact with Sephardim in London. Lamashal, in London, the Sephardim in London were using Moroccan esrogim. Now, the whole culture of esrogim in Morocco is very different. It describes how, Ashkenazim, it's Alts, mit Nerven, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks before Sukkot, you go to the esrog Seicher, and we're down in the ganzen Nervez and checking and looking. And Morocco, the Ungarish Yid ended up there during World War II. He describes he was in Morocco. Erev Sukkot, someone walked into shul with a big sack of esrogim, put the sack down on the table, everyone went over, oh, it looks good. And that's the extent of it. A whole different attitude towards mitzvahs or towards the fruit, whatever the case may be. Then in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, some people started importing them also to the Ashkenazi countries proper in Europe and Eastern Europe. Certainly after World War II, it definitely took off as a big option. You go to any frum community, you'll see signs, Moroccan esrogim. Seemingly there's nothing, what can you say against it? It has a nice Messiah, you have been using it. He says, I believe it was in 1967, as late as 1967, a fellow by the name of Rabbi Shraga Shlomai, an immigrant to Israel, was involved in this tchum. He wrote a whole kuntres. He was also involved in the esrog business, so he wrote a whole kuntres to explain why his particular Eretz Yisrael Dika type of esrog is the only good one and all the rest are bad. And what about Morocco? So he was the first one, apparently, to point out that Moroccan esrogim, they don't have seeds. They don't have seeds. I don't know what this is. It's not an esrog, or it's very murkov with something. Who knows? Of course, he went after Yanaveh and Yemen and everything else as well. Right? Like I said, Yemen doesn't have juice. So he said he figured out the ones that the Rabbanim of Yushalayim were always using for the 200 years before, 150 years before that, whatever it was. He tracked down and found that tree, that bush. So he set the ball rolling. Now there's this whole argument, accusation. The Rabbanim that responded to him said, what do you mean, you're trying to be mitzi laws on Moroccan Jews? I mean, the Doyle Torah, they lived in Morocco for hundreds of years. As far as we can tell, this is what they were using. So now, there's people that are more impressed by this argument, people that are less impressed. I have some examples of Rabbanim in Europe. Shlomo Kluger, his son wrote that Shlomo Kluger already used the Moroccan esrog. The Aruch Lener in Germany wrote about esrogim. He said he used the Moroccan esrog. He said it was very he found the Moroccan esrog was very muhuder. Those who are against Moroccan esrogim say, no, Muslim Zagan, that those Gedolim must have gotten a different Moroccan esrog that had seeds. You think they would have cut it open? In the whole sugya of checking esrogim, you think they would have cut it open, seen that there are no seeds, and not said anything? Muslim Zagan, they must have had the kosher ones, and somehow they've all been erased and replaced with the non-kosher ones. And this was an argument. He quotes different people who wrote Shuvas and the Mems, including Menashe Klein, the Mishnah Halachas, that were arguing that there's something wrong with these esrogim. So the person who wrote this, his big chiddush discovery is that he found a rare makar from 200 years ago, one of the earliest Ashkenazim to talk about the Moroccan esrog, and Dafki, he already mentioned that there are no seeds inside. So that meant that they were always this way, and then the Rabbanim that came after him and said they were good, Kanira, they saw it and it didn't bother them, and they're makabel the svaris, that it's doesn't prove anything about the esrogim. So what's the makar that he found? So he says there was a Rav in London, Reb Shlomo Herschel, Rabbi Solomon Herschel. His father was Tzvi Hirsch Berliner, big Rav, and he ended up as the Rav of the Ashkenazim in London, and he was interacting with the Sfardim in London, and so he wrote this letter, and it was printed in a sefer called Pinais Habayis in the Tafresh Nuns or something. Someone still had this letter. This is a letter he wrote in Tafkov Ayin Vav, 1815, Cheshvan 1815. So he writes, he starts up by, interestingly, the first thing he says is the esrogim from Suriname. Now Suriname, for those from South America, Suriname is at the north of South America. It's besmichas to the islands in the Caribbean. Now, there's a whole interesting history of esrogim being grown in America. And there's professor, I believe, by the name of Jonathan Sarna, and he's written recently in a number of places about the history of growing esrogim in America. California, here, there, one of the big, it says that, I think Columbus himself already brought the citron. When he came to Jamaica, he brought the citron to Jamaica, and they started growing there. This was, like I said, back then it was a fruit that had commercial use regardless, and people started Yidden who were in this area wanted to use it for sukkahs. Give me 2 or 3 more minutes. We'll try to wind down over here. So it became a Gvarna Shaila at the time, and the early 1800s, you start seeing this discussion among Rabbanim, are these West Indian, Caribbean esrogim, are they good or not? Now, the way nature, basic fact of nature, that if you take the same fruit and you plant it in different locations on Earth, automatically it's going to look different. It's never going to look exactly the same. Just the climate and the geographical differences. Trying to figure out the story with the West Indian esrogim and the ones from Barbaria. What's Barbaria? The Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast refers to the area that we call today Morocco. He says, I haven't figured out the story. He says, I looked at the Suriname and the Italians, and they're pretty much the same, but the difference is how much juice they have. And then he makes this logical point that it's hard to be medayek from the juice. On the one hand, juice, lemon, but on the other hand, he says, geographically, you grow the same thing. He says, the mashal, the figs. You grow the figs in our countries, he says, they're disgusting. If you grow them in the Middle East, they're delicious. So that can have a huge impact. So that, at this point, he wasn't bothered by it so much. Sarna quote that later on, a few decades later, someone printed after Rabbi Herschel passed away. A few years later, he said, I spoke to Rabbi Herschel in London, and he told me that West Indian esrogim are no good. And Taka, at some point, that was the last we heard of them. But then he goes on and says, but the esrogim from Barbaria, I caught them, hundreds of them, he says, and I never found af garin echad. And I was shocked. Isn't this hepach teva habriya? Didn't the Eibusher say that every fruit should have seeds? So there must be more kavim. And maybe that's why it's like a mule. Just like a mule is an akar because it's a hybrid. So it could be they're hybridized and they're all fruits that are all akar and they all don't have seeds for that reason. So we see that he's acknowledging this mitzias, and Taka bothered him. The Rabbanim that came after him then said that they thought it was fine. Muslim Zaga, and that they were also talking about the seedless ones, and it didn't bother them. They didn't agree with his svara. What's the answer to his svara? So this fellow's name is Rabbi Mendel Goldstein. I think he's a Satmar from Monroe. His argument is essentially that if you go to the actual trees in Morocco, you'll see that there's the long, narrow Moroccan esrogim. That's the Moroccan giddel. All the esrogim that are like that don't have seeds, and because there are no seeds, that's why they're long and narrow. He says if you go to those trees, you'll see that they also have large round ones. The large round ones do have seeds. Every single tree has both. It's a taka unusual, interesting fluke in nature. What caused that? I don't know if we can explain exactly. But the fact that those very same trees have both, and fakir, it could be those other ones look more like esrogim that we're familiar with that do have seeds. He says this proves and confirms that these are regular esrogim. For whatever reason, this particular one doesn't, the particular types that were used for the mitzvah happen not to have seeds in them, but it comes from a regular min of esrog. The esrog, of course, has seeds, just like any other fruit. And the male, in his opinion, in this way we've proven the authenticity of Moroccan esrogim, and we've proven that there is in fact no problem with them, and we can rely on the Rabbanim that prefer the Moroccan esrog. That is the pro-Moroccan esrog argument. Mitzvah Hashem, like I said, next week hopefully will be mamshech and other aspects of this very large discussion.